Consult the doctor. Sorry. I have prepared again 4 of your questions. And let's start off with the first one. How do I select a good nibmeister from all the options? That is a remarkably profound question. How do we do anything in life, really? How do we make decisions? I once saw a wonderful interview with Richard Feynman where he was asked about something innocent, like how does magnetism work? And then that turned into a whole discussion about, but what is how and what is why? So I'm not trying to be funny. There are many nibmeisters, and there is an increasing number of them, which in many ways I think is good news, because that means you have more options at your disposal. The bad news is, we know that the more options people get, the harder it becomes to make a decision. That's kind of obvious, yes, I know, but that's actually research finding. Too many options can make people feel stressed, because then they don't know what to choose anymore. I'm not a consumer psychologist, but I mean, anyway, that is a known finding. A good start might be my video entitled On Nibmeisters, which gives some suggestions. If you ask me, then I'm assuming that you value my opinion, so my opinion is encased in that video. Having said that, trying to answer this in a somewhat more general fashion, I guess you're going to have to do some research and see what people say online. I think there are certain nibmeisters with an outstanding reputation. My favorite nibmeister is Mike Masayama, but Mike Masayama has become so popular that he has long wait lists, sometimes multiple months, depends on the time of the year and all that kind of stuff. That's the downside to success, but that probably means that he's doing a very good job because he gets a lot of business and people clearly flock to him. Having said that, for everyone who does a good job, there will be at least one person online who's had a bad experience and will be very vocal about that terrible experience. So it's difficult. For me, it's a matter of look around, see what kind of review someone has received online. And I know that a nibmeister is not exactly the same as a store, which gets reviews on Google. But still, you'll be able to find with relative ease certain information about certain people. Think of going on to a fountain pen forum and looking around what people have said. A quick search for nibmeisters will yield a lot of information about those particular people. So that's what I would do. And beyond that, of course, you could ask people who've been in touch or have used the services of a number of nibmeisters. I don't know if I have solicited the services of a number of nibmeisters, but I have used nibs from different nibmeisters over the years, even if those were not on my pens. There were pens that I tried out at pen meets, etc. So yes, I've seen a lot of the work of different nibmeisters, and some of them for me are very good. But for more details, do watch that video on nibmeisters, because I don't want to repeat myself just out of respect for everyone's time. That whole video is devoted to it, my different experiences, and by no means is it an exhaustive list. There are so many nibmeisters now, I simply can't cover them all. Okay? I hope that's an answer to your question. The next question is a very pragmatic one. I'm just looking down to put in a timestamp. What does overpolished mean? That is a very pragmatic question and a good one. So you have a nib, you don't have a nib. That's not a part of the human body, but you do have a fountain pen, and that fountain pen has a nib, and that nib consists of a number of different aspects that have different names. So you have in the nib, and the nib ends in the tines, and the tines end in tipping material. And then in between the tines is a slit, or slits if you have, for example, a music nib, which typically has 2 slits and therefore 3 tines. But most fountain pen nibs have 2 tines with 1 slit in between the tines. Now, at the end of those tines is tipping material, and that tipping material is a type of metal that is very, very hard. That's very important. If you were to make a nib out of solid gold, which people do, and you would have actual gold touching the paper, gold is relatively soft, so it would grind down very, very quickly. And as a result, then you end up with a little sad stump of a nib, which is not something that is very conducive to a pleasant writing experience. To make a smooth writing experience, you need to polish the tipping material, and that tipping material needs to be polished in a very specific way. For the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to be talking about round nibs, so an extra fine, medium broad, maybe double broad or triple broad nib, but I'm not talking about italics, cursive italics, crisp italics, stubs, that kind of stuff, okay? But all those different types of nibs that I've just mentioned have their own specific geometry in which that specific tipping material gets polished. So, for example, if you have a true italic nib, it has very squared off tipping material. But as I said, I will limit myself to round nibs. Round nibs are, as the name suggests, round. And that means you get the same line width, whether you write side to side or write down typically. In an italic nib, that would be different because the downstroke would be broad, but the side stroke would be relatively narrow. But as I said, I will limit myself to round nibs. So, when the tines of a nib get over-polished, then something is off with the geometry of that specific polishing job, and there are consequences to that. If the inside of the tines get polished too much, you end up with a syndrome that we affectionately call baby's bottom. If you happen to have mastered the Greek alphabet, think of a lowercase omega, and then you know exactly what I mean. You get a shape that is something like this. And unfortunately, where those two tines meet in the center, they actually move up too far, and as a result, you don't have good contact with the paper. Is that an issue? Yes, it is, because in such a scenario, you will get a very smooth writer. The writing experience will be very, very smooth if the nib writes, because there's not proper contact between the nib tines and the paper. That nib will start to skip. And when it skips, that's very annoying because you get a little bit of ink and then no ink and a little bit of ink and no ink, etc. Every time you put the pen to paper, you can have those kinds of hard start issues. And that's very obnoxious. Fortunately, there are people, see previous question, on nibmeisters who can solve that issue for you with relative ease because it's a relatively simple fix. It's just something that requires fixing if you want to have a fountain pen that writes properly all the time, every time. You can do this yourself, but then you kind of need to know what you are doing, especially on more expensive pens. I tend to prefer to just spend a little bit of money, usually talking well under $100, $40, $50, something like that. Depends a bit on the specific nibmeister you go to. They will fix it, they will do a professional job, and you will probably see a massive difference in how that pen used to write and how it writes. I had an italic nib. I said I was only going to talk about round nibs. I had an italic nib and a Converse Stewart. Beautiful italic nib, really square tipping, beautiful. But it skipped like crazy. 10 minutes in the hands of Mike Masayama at a pen show, and it wrote beautifully. So it can make a big difference. That's what I would say. I hope this was a clear explanation of not just over-polish, but the issue that arises when a nib is over-polished. Again, it'll be very smooth because I suppose that's the final part of the question. Then why does anyone over-polish nibs? Well, companies do it sometimes because it makes for a very smooth writing experience. But the downside to that is that a pen may skip a lot, and that's of course not desirable. But if you try it out in a shop, it would feel very, very smooth. And when you dip it, the nib and the feed are so saturated with ink that you may not really notice that skipping behavior. Because it's a little insidious, but too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And that goes with polishing too. Too smooth a nib will actually have issues. Okay. Question 3. Do any other nib units screw into the Opus 88 housing? Well, I think it's JoWo housing, so they'll take JoWo nibs. And B.R.E and JoWo nib collars are not exactly the same, so they probably won't fit. One thing that you can do with certain of the number 6 Opus 88 pens is pull out the nib. It's not really a traditional nib, but the nib from a Pilot Parallel pen, which are very wide calligraphy nibs, the whole unit, and that whole unit just kind of slips into some of the Opus 88 pens. I'm not an expert at this. Other people online are. You can find this fairly easily if you Google Opus 88 Pilot Parallel, and then you have sort of a calligraphy nib. Not sort of. You have a calligraphy nib in a traditional fountain pen, which some people find nice because the Pilot Parallels have kind of an odd shape that's not for everyone. So that is always an option. Next question. Final question. What is the story with the fox? The story with the fox is that the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog as a pangram. In other words, a sentence that incorporates every letter of the alphabet. In this case, the Roman alphabet. And I've used that sentence from the first video in which I reviewed a fountain pen, and then it kind of stuck, and then it became a thing, and because it became a thing, I kept using it. And it's not something I've invented, it's just a pengram. There are many other pengrams, but this one is mine. So as a result, I use it because it became associated with my videos, and I've seen no need to change it. Then when I required a logo, because people kept telling me I needed a logo, I had a professional artist design a logo, and she came up with a fox because of the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog sentence that I use, where the tail of the fox is actually a nib, which I thought was a really clever, fun design that was also kind of cute. Then I made the mistake of using that much requested logo as the thumbnail to videos, and a gong show ensued. Unfortunately, not everyone can be satisfied, so this is how it is, but that is the story of the fox. I think that's it, but I have for today. If you have any questions, please leave them below, because I'm working through them, and I record a couple of these videos in a row, so it may take a little bit of time before I get to your question, but I do try to get through them. So if you don't see a question answered in the next video, don't be disappointed. It's probably coming up, but it can take 2, 3, or 4 videos, depending on what my backlog of questions is. That's what I have. I hope this was useful. If it was not useful, I'm sorry. I'll try to do better next time. I will gladly see you again next time. Thank you so much for watching, and that's all there's to it. Bye! I'm clicking the wrong button.